with a multiple point proposal, which basically said
we'll leave this discussion here as the U.S. Senate is about to gavel in. Senators will pick up where they left off yesterday after recessing unexpectedly due to the Washington Navy Yard shooting. Senators will begin the day with general speeches and will be looking for reaction to the shooting from lawmakers. Senators will also vote today on judicial nominations and continue work on an energy efficiency bill. And now live to the Senate floor.
The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Savior, who promised to never forsake us, be a shield for this land we love. As flags fly at half-staff, in remembrance of the victims of yesterday's Washington Navy Yard shooting, teach us to use wisely all the time you give us. Show your mighty power during seasons of distress, transforming negatives into positives and dark yesterdays into bright tomorrows. Today, guide our lawmakers, inspiring them in their going out and coming in, as you give them the wisdom to labor not simply for time, but for eternity. Lord, bless us all with strength of will, steadiness of purpose, and power to persevere. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., September 17, 2013. To the Senate. Under provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Edward J. Markey, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I wish we could do more, but I do ask that we now ask unanimous consent that the Senate now observe a moment of silence in honor of the victims of the tragic Navy Yard, those killed and those suffering from the wounds inflicted in that terrible day that occurred not far from the Capitol.
Without objection. Majority Leader.
Following my remarks, the Senate will be in a period of morning business. Majority will control the first 30 minutes, Republicans the second 30 minutes. I ask consent that at 11:30 the Senate proceed to executive session under the previous order. Consider the Campbell-Smith and Kaplan nominations, both nominees to the Federal Claims Court. Following the disposition of those nominees, the Senate will recess until 2:15 this afternoon to allow us to have our weekly caucus meetings. And finally, at 2:15, the Senate will resume consideration of S. 1392, the Energy Savings and Industrial Competitiveness Act. Mr. President, we're trying to come up with a finite list of amendments to move forward on that legislation. We hope that, in fact, can happen. There It's my understanding Senator Vitter has an amendment that he wants to offer. He's been around here a few times during the time we've been in session, and we would have an amendment, second degree or side by side his amendment. But in our effort to do that, we have to have a finite list of amendments. We have can't go on with unrelated amendments forever on this bill. So there'll be one roll call vote at noon. We hope to vote on energy efficiency amendments whenever there's agreement that can be made. Mr. President, there are no words that can possibly ease the pain of the rampage and certainly the deaths involving a dozen human beings who were killed yesterday at the Naval Yard. I hope it's some small comfort that this city, this institution, the United States Senate, and a whole nation mourn alongside them. To my knowledge, there's no explanation for the violence that occurred yesterday. My thoughts are with those who are suffering as a result of the loss of their loved ones, and also those people who are recovering from the wounds, and some of them are very serious. I wish them a speedy recovery. Mr. President, we have about 16,000 military and civilian employees who work in the Naval Yard complex, as well as their friends, family members who were affected by this tragedy. It was only a few days ago, and the officer presiding was here at on that occasion also, when we as members of Congress marked the anniversary of September 11th, 2001, during a ceremony on the steps of the Capitol, but we had a moment of silence here in the Senate. Yesterday's shootings are the worst loss of life in the Capital region since those September 11th attacks. It centered on the Pentagon as far as in this area. Last week's significant anniversary and yesterday's terrible violence are a reminder that life is fragile and precious. They're a reminder of the debt we owe to those who protect our freedom and our safety, whether they serve in the military or as first responders. The Sergeant at Arms, who was responsible for our safety, was certainly on the job yesterday. He is a dedicated police officer. That's his goal. I still refer to him as Chief Gaynor. He's been Chief of Police of the Capitol Police Force before he took responsibility as Sergeant at Arms of the Senate. He's been a street officer a long time. He could have done other things. He has a law degree. He's a well-educated man. But his responsibility is to take care of the Senate, and he does that very well. I appreciate very, very much, I speak for the entire Senate, of those dedicated police, fire, rescue, who put their lives on the line to prevent a lot more loss of life on Monday. In particular, Mr. President, the city owes a debt of gratitude to a canine officer, 24-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Force, a man by the name of Scott Williams, who was hurt very, very badly in the shootings. I wish him a full recovery and thank him for his selflessness. Mr. President, we have to return to the business at hand. Since the moment President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act, making it the law of the land and ensuring every American has access to quality health insurance at a price they can afford, Republicans have been on an absurd quest to undo this progress. Republican members of Congress are horrified every day. They were horrified when, you know what, the United States Supreme Court said the law we call Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, is constitutional. That's what the Supreme Court said. In spite of this being the law of the land, and it is the law of the land, House Republicans alone have voted more than 40 times to repeal Obamacare. and are now threatening to shut down the entire government unless this Congress denies funding to implement this very, very constitutional law. Under Obamacare, members of Congress and their staffs will be covered by exactly the same plans that will extend health insurance to millions of Americans next year. 535 members of Congress and 16,000 staff are treated like other employees across America in the law. They're treated that way under Obamacare. And rightfully so. And like 150 million other Americans who get their health insurance through their jobs, that is their employer, the federal government will share part of the cost of that health care for us, for the 16,000 who work here in the Capitol complex, as it has for all federal employees for many decades. These are the people, Mr. President, in Carson City, Nevada, Reno, Nevada, and Las Vegas, Nevada, who answer the phones and help people with problems dealing with Social Security, with veterans benefits, with whether they can be buried at the beautiful cemetery we have in Fernley for veterans, or the one in Boulder City, which is, we bury lots and lots of people that are veterans every day, Mr. President. These are the inquiries we get in our offices around the state of Nevada. And those people work long, hard hours to respond to those requests. They're dedicated public servants. And that's who the junior senator from Louisiana said, no thanks. They're not entitled to anything as far as being treated like everybody else. So even more direct and to the point, Mr. President, members of Congress and our staff will live by the same rules and get their health care from the same exchanges as other Americans. But the junior senator from Louisiana, I repeat, and a number of other misguided Republicans want to force members of Congress and their staffs to live by a different set of rules. Although Senator Vitter has happily allowed the federal government to pay for a portion of his health insurance for many, many years as a member of the House of Representatives and as a member of the Senate, now he wants to force these 16,000 congressional workers to cover the full cost of the health insurance. With this background, one must ask, if Senator Vitter opposes the employer contribution for congressional staffers, does he oppose it also for the 150 million other Americans whose employers help pay their health insurance premiums? Does he want to discourage private employers from doing the right thing and providing their employees with affordable health insurance? Is that what he wants? Just to do away with insurance that 150 million Americans have in America? Millions, I repeat, millions and millions of employers rely on this important benefit to attract the best and brightest and hardest working people they can find. Ending the employer contribution would effectively slap 150 million Americans with a pay cut, and a big pay cut. Is that Senator Vitter's intention? If Republican senators believe they should bear the full cost of their own health insurance, they can, without any change in the law, they can decline the federal government's employer contribution and pay their own way. They can even encourage their own staffs to do so. Why they would want to do that, I don't understand, but they could do that. But for Senator Vitter and his Republican allies to end the contribution for 16,000 hardworking federal employees, even after years of accepting the subsidy themselves, is hypocritical and mean-spirited. In truth, this is only the latest Republican attempt to derail the successful implementation of Obamacare. Last November, there was a big poll taken. It's called an election, where Americans overwhelmingly voted to re-elect President Obama and to keep Obamacare as the law of the land. That was the issue of the campaign. Who won that? The American people won, and President Obama won. And Obamacare, the constitutional law of the land, the American people said, let's go ahead and do it. So Americans have spoken very loudly and very clearly. It's time to move on to something else. It's the law. and has been. And on October 1st, about 25 million Americans who have no health insurance will have, for the first time, most of them in their entire lifetime, the ability to get insurance. And what we found in New York alone, the insurance is going to save 50% of what it did before. It's 50% cheaper. Nevada's cheaper. It's the way it is all over the country. According to the voters and according to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, Obamacare is the law of the land. It's time for Republicans to mature. I guess you could say it a different way, to grow up. And recognize this is the law in America and has been for years. It's time for Republicans to stop denying reality. The Senate should be passing other stuff, Mr. President. We should be passing an energy efficiency bill that will save taxpayers money, create good-paying jobs. We need that. Bridges. I've said here before, 70,000 bridges are in a state of disrepair. Yesterday, a report came out that 8,000 of them are near collapse. 8,000. We're not spending money to take care of that problem. Our highways, our roads, our dams need money. This, Mr. President, isn't money that just goes to the federal government, so you can have a truck that says federal government building a road or fixing a dam. The money goes to the private sector. That's what we should be doing. For every $1 billion we spend in doing something about the highways, bridges, roads, dams, water systems, sewer systems, we create 47,500 high-paying jobs and thousands of other jobs spin off from that. That's what we should be doing. We should be facing the reality of climate change. Look what happened in Colorado. I talked to Senator Bennett yesterday. He said the floods were biblical. In one part of Colorado, it rained 12 inches in 2 hours. I can't imagine that. Fires all over the West. Climate change is here. I met with the Foreign Minister of Bangladesh. They don't know what they're going to do. With the rise of the sea, which is taking place, that country has no place, there's no high ground. It's that way all over the world. Marshall Islands, 1,000 islands make up the Marshall Islands. 55,000 people live there. These islands are being washed away with the new waves they've never seen before. Climate change is here. We're doing nothing about it. They're spending all of our time, American taxpayers' time, trying to repeal a law that's been in effect for 4 years. We should be doing something about immigration reform. They talk about wanting to do something for the economy. Try passing immigration reform. It creates, to the positive, $1 trillion. It would reduce our debt by $1 trillion. Let's do that. Let's fix our broken tax system. We should be doing those things, not relitigating a 4-year-old policy battle, but instead of working with Democrats to effectively implement Obamacare or pass a new law that benefits middle-class families, Republicans are obsessed with fighting a real old battle, and they're doing it at taxpayer expense. And instead of standing with millions of Americans who are already benefiting from Obamacare, Republicans are standing with insurance companies that would return us to a time when profits came before people. That's the way it was. Since President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act into law, insurance companies can no longer discriminate against children with pre-existing conditions. That's a good deal. If you have a child with diabetes, that boy or girl can't be denied insurance. Epilepsy can't be denied insurance. And in just a short few months, Mr. President, all Americans will no longer be able to be denied insurance coverage because of pre-existing illness. They can no longer raise your rates for no reason. They can no longer drop your coverage if you get sick. That's the law today. Today, children can no longer be denied insurance, as I've indicated, because they're born with a disease or a disability. And that, I repeat, will soon be extended to all Americans, no matter their age. And listen to this one. And very soon, a woman will no longer be considered a pre-existing condition as it was before Obamacare passed. In my relatively sparsely populated state of Nevada, tens of thousands of seniors have saved tens of millions of dollars on medicines because the Affordable Care Act has helped close the gap on prescription drug coverage. More than 3 million young people, including 33,000 young Nevadans, have been able to stay on their parents' health policies until they're 26 years old. 3 million. And hundreds of thousands of businesses that already offer their employees health insurance are getting tax credits for doing the right thing. In just a few months, almost 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions. And what are some of these pre-existing conditions? I talked about it generally a minute ago. High blood pressure, all kinds of things that happen as you get older. Will have access to reasonably priced coverage, no matter their high blood pressure or their heart condition or whatever the situation might be. And 25 million Americans who can't afford these health insurance, can't afford health insurance, today will be offered health insurance on the exchanges. Republicans have been trying for years to erase these gains and force millions of Americans' families once again to rely on the most expensive care in America today is where? It's emergency rooms. Hospitals hate it because it runs, their bad debt goes up, and all it does is drive up the cost of insurance. The care is not as good as it would be if they could go when they were really first get sick, but they go there out of desperation. That's what I assume Republicans want everyone to do. Everyone can go to emergency room, but it's so expensive and really doesn't do the trick. So punishing the hardworking congressional staff who put in long hours because they believe in public service, that is the work we do here in Congress, won't roll back the benefits of Obamacare. Punishing congressional staffers won't prevent millions of Americans from getting health insurance they need and deserve next year. And it will hurt thousands of men and women, including Senator Vitter's colleagues and his own staff. Instead of willfully denying Obamacare as a law or purposely trying to derail its implementation, it's time for Senator Vitter to help us to improve the law of the land and ensure every American has access to the kind of care members of Congress enjoy already, as do 150 other Americans who get health care through their employers.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
This morning all of us are thinking about yesterday's tragic events at the Navy Yard, and we're also thinking in particular of the brave men and women of our military and the sacrifices they make day in and day out on our behalf. Once again, I'd like to extend condolences to the families and friends of those who lost their lives or were injured in this terrible, terrible shooting. Know that your country is with you in these most difficult moments. And I'd also like, again, to express sincere gratitude to all the first responders and medical personnel and law enforcement officers from so many different agencies who work together to keep all of us informed and, most of all, safe throughout the day. Mr. President, I have a statement on another subject which I would ask consent be inserted in the record at this point.
Without objection.
And I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, there will now be a period of morning business until 11:30 a.m., with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the majority controlling the first 30 minutes and the Republicans controlling the next 30 minutes.
President.
The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, flags across America are being flown at half-mast this morning because of the terrible tragedy which occurred out that door 1.5 miles away yesterday. Men and women who work for our Department of Defense to keep America safe reported to work as usual on a Monday morning. And then tragedy struck. A gunman appeared with an assault rifle, several other weapons. At the end of it, 12 innocent people died, another dozen or so seriously injured. This Capitol was in shock. It was locked down at some point to ward off the possibility there were other shooters and more danger outside. And we watched as the people who worked at the Navy Yard and those who worked at adjoining buildings waited patiently for the police to do their important and courageous work. At the end of the day, they showed television footage of these employees being bussed away from the Navy Yard to a safe metro location to return home, all but 12 of them, who sadly lost their lives to this senseless gun tragedy. We read the papers this morning trying to understand what could possibly motivate a person to do this. And as we read the background of the shooter, it was clear there were moments in his life when he had used a firearm to shoot tires on a car that he thought shouldn't be parked in his driveway, and shoot a gun in his own apartment that went through the ceiling to an adjoining apartment. Those sorts of things might have been warning signals. Questions are raised. How could a man with that kind of a background end up getting the necessary security clearance for a military contractor to go into this Navy Yard, to be permitted to go into this Navy Yard? How did he get these weapons into this Navy Yard, an assault rifle and other firearms? Questions that still remain to be answered. God forbid we go on with business as usual today and not understand what happened yesterday. What happened yesterday brings into question some important values in America. If we value our right for ourselves and our families and our children to be safe, if we value this Constitution, if we value the right of every American to enjoy their liberties with reasonable limitations, then we need to return to issues that are of importance. There was an issue before the Senate several months ago, a bipartisan amendment offered by Senators Manchin and Toomey, that would have taken an extra step to keep guns out of the hands of those who have a history of felonies or people who are mentally unstable. The vast majority of Americans think this is just common sense. We can protect the right of law-abiding citizens to use guns in a responsible, legal way for sporting and hunting and self-defense, but we've got to do everything we can to keep guns out of the hands of those who would misuse them. Felons who have a history of misusing firearms, the mentally unstable who can't be trusted to have a firearm. But today we pause and reflect on the lives lost. I hope the lessons learned. I had a hearing scheduled this morning before the Senate Judiciary Committee on a controversial issue involving firearms. In light of what had happened yesterday, in light of the uncertainty of our schedule today, I'm rescheduling that hearing. It's an important one, and I want to say to those who are following it that it will be rescheduled. But at this point in time, we have decided to postpone it for today until another day in the near future. Mr. President, let's talk for a minute about the Vitter amendment that's on the floor. 1/2 of all Americans have a common experience, and the experience is this: they get health insurance where they work. 1/2 of all Americans. And for virtually all of them, their employer pays for part of their health insurance premium. And the employer gets a tax break. if you own a company and offer health insurance to your employees, we have what we call the employer's exclusion for health care benefits. In other words, what you pay for your employees' health insurance is excluded from your income for tax purposes. It's one of the most expensive exclusions in the tax code, but it's a valuable one because it encourages businesses to offer health insurance to their employees, which is important for those families, important for our nation. And, of course, when it comes to the federal government, the same rule applies. The employer, the federal government, offers health insurance to its employees under what's known as the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program. 8 million Americans, representing federal employees and their families, get their health insurance through the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program. It includes members of Congress. We don't have a special health insurance plan. We have the same plan that millions of federal employees have. And our staff enjoy those same privileges. Well, now we're in a period of transition because of the new Affordable Care Act. This Affordable Care Act says, from this point forward, that members of Congress, as well as their staff members, will no longer be insured by the Federal Employees Health Benefit Program, but instead will become part of the insurance exchanges that were created. These exchanges, which are going to be in virtually every state, either because of state sponsorship, federal sponsorship, or shared responsibility, will offer health insurance plans across America, so that those that currently don't have health insurance today will be able to apply for a plan under the insurance exchange. If they are extremely low-income individuals, they will get help, subsidies and tax treatment that help them pay for their premiums. The notion is, no matter where you live, you will have access to health insurance. And the health insurance offered by these exchanges and by every other company in America will change because of this law. Change for the better. Senator Reid spoke about it earlier. Pre-existing conditions. How many of us don't have a pre-existing condition or somebody in our family with a pre-existing condition? Perhaps someone in your family was treated for cancer or diabetes or even mental illness. In the past, health insurance companies could discriminate against you and say, sorry, we don't offer health care plans to cancer survivors. Well, that's no longer the case. This new law, the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, says that health insurance policies from this point forward have to cover pre-existing conditions, not just in children when it's implemented, but adults as well. The Republicans are saying we want to repeal that. We don't want to put that new provision in the law. We don't want to cover those, require insurance companies to cover those with pre-existing conditions. There's another change in the law. Some health insurance policies today have limits on how much they'll pay. Well, I can tell you, be careful. If your health insurance plan says, we will cover your bills up to, say, $100,000, be careful. You could go in tomorrow, or someone in your family, and be diagnosed with a cancer condition requiring extensive medical care that far exceeds $100,000 in cost. Under Obamacare, there are no limits on health insurance protection. If you have a terrible illness or someone in your family does, the insurance policy will cover you. The Republicans want to repeal this provision so that they can set limits on health insurance policies, limits which could literally bankrupt a family with a terrible terrible medical condition which they are working on and trying to deal with. That's one of the provisions that's in Obamacare that the Republicans want to appeal. The issue on the floor today is the Vitter Amendment. Senator Vitter's from Louisiana, and he came to the floor last week and he said, since members of Congress and their staff are now going into these insurance exchanges, it is time for us to eliminate the employer contribution for members of Congress and their staff. They have to pay it all, 100% of the premium. Unlike 150 million Americans who get health insurance through their employment and their employer pays a portion of it, when it comes to congressional staff and members of Congress, no employer contribution, pay it all. Well, it turns out that that's exactly the opposite of the way Senator Vitter voted on the floor of the United States Senate on an amendment offered by Senator Grassley, 3564, on the Affordable Care Act, Senator Vitter voted during the debate on this issue to protect the right of congressional employees and others for employer contributions. Now he's reversed himself. Now he says no employer contribution. This is unfair. It is unfair to do this to the employees of the Senate as well as the members. All that we are asking is that this group of individuals be treated the same as every other American with health insurance through their employment. My fear is that this isn't the end of Senator Vitter's crusade against health insurance by employers. I think this is a first step. The next step could be to eliminate the employer's contribution for health insurance across the board. That would be devastating, absolutely devastating and fundamentally unfair. To see workers across America, not just congressional employees, federal workers, workers in the private sector, paying the entire premium with no employer contribution. That's a good way to eliminate coverage, not to expand it. And we should be expanding health insurance coverage. I listened to the senator from Louisiana describe the employer's contribution to health insurance as a federal subsidy. A federal subsidy. Well, I guess technically he's right. Because the tax code says to employers, we'll give you special positive tax treatment if you offer health insurance. So the tax code does, in fact, subsidize all employers who offer to pay a part of their employees' health insurance premiums. Okay, I'll accept that definition, but that is a worthy subsidy. Even though it's the most expensive provision in the tax code, it is a worthy subsidy because it encourages more health insurance. It makes it more affordable for working families in Louisiana, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, and across the United States. If Senator Vitter is going out to attack an employer's contribution to health insurance as a federal subsidy we can no longer afford, then say it on the floor of the Senate. Let's have an up or down vote. And I challenge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand up for the working families across America, in the private sector, in the public sector, our congressional employees, even members of Congress, to be treated the same. No special preference for members of Congress, but employer contributions protected under the law, regardless of whether you buy the plan in the private sector or in the public sector. I think this is an important vote. And I think some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, so determined to end Obamacare, so determined to put an end to this effort to reduce the increased costs of health insurance premiums and to make health insurance more available to people across America and basically a sound investment for your health insurance future. I think those Republicans who are determined to eliminate that have some questions to answer. They want to eliminate the provision in Obamacare which says that parents can keep their kids under their health insurance policy until that young man or woman reaches the age of 26. Is it important? Well, do you have a son or daughter graduating college soon who can't find a full-time job? Are you worried about whether they're going to have health insurance? They can stay on your policy, Mom and Dad, until they reach the age of 26. The Republicans want to repeal it. Also, we have a prescription drug program for seniors. It's very popular. Part D says we're going to help seniors pay for medicine so they can stay well and healthy and independent and strong and not end up in a hospital or a convalescent center or a nursing home. We, in the Obamacare bill, extend the protection of this prescription program for Medicare recipients. The Republicans want to repeal that. How in the world can that be in our best interest? For seniors, many of them on fixed incomes with limited savings, to have to pay more for their prescription drugs? Is that the Republican answer? It's not a good one if that's what they're proposing. So when it comes to quality health insurance that won't discriminate against people for pre-existing conditions, when it comes to quality health insurance that has to offer maternity benefits, hard to believe, isn't it? Health insurance plans before Obamacare could exclude maternity benefits. One of our senators this morning said up to 60% of the policies don't cover the birth of a child. They have to now under Obamacare, but the Republicans would repeal that requirement, leaving more women in a situation where they have to pay out of pocket for prenatal care and the delivery of a child. How can that be in the best interest of a healthy America? We want moms, as soon as they know they're pregnant, to come see a doctor, go through the ordinary prenatal care, have that healthy, happy baby that makes such a difference in your life. Is it important? I think it is. It's in Obamacare, and the Republicans want to repeal it. Why? If they want to change some provisions, if they want to debate them and amend them, let's do it. You know, when it gets down to it, there's not a perfect law that's ever been passed. We can always change them for the better if we do it in good faith, in the democratic way, small d, and that's the way it should happen. But instead, the House of Representatives, which the presiding officer served in before joining us here in the Senate, has voted 41 times to repeal Obamacare. 41 times. One time, a Republican leader over there tried to change one provision, perhaps even improve it, and his own Republican caucus turned on him and said, no, 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 we don't want to approve it. The last thing I want to say is this. Those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it. I think that's etched on the side of one of our buildings downtown here. The year was 1935. Franklin Delano Roosevelt looked around America and saw that the poorest group of Americans turned out to be elderly people. People who could no longer work and had nowhere to turn. And sadly, many of them had no choice. They went to live among poor people in a poorhouse, or if they were lucky enough, their kids took them in. If you hear the story of your own family, and they can remember back when, Grandma and Grandpa moved in that spare bedroom because he couldn't work anymore and they had nowhere to turn. So Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 said, let's do something about it. Let's create an insurance plan. Here's what it says. You pay premiums on this insurance plan while you're working, and when you reach the age of 65, we'll pay you at least some money each month to get by. They called this insurance plan Social Security. It was part of the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. Pretty sensible, but controversial too. Do you know what the Republican reaction was to Social Security in 1935? Here on the floor of the United States Senate, there was a Republican filibuster to stop Roosevelt from implementing Social Security. They wouldn't let him open the Social Security offices he needed across America, nor give him the staff. A Republican filibuster stopped it. Then in 1936, the Republican candidate for president was Alf Landon, a progressive Republican governor from Kansas. Alf Landon said, if I am elected president of the United States in 1936, my first act of office will be to repeal Social Security. And then, when they started implementing it, the Chamber of Commerce in Washington here sent out notices to employers across America to put a notice in the pay envelope, and it said, the 1% you're paying in the Social Security, Mr. Worker, is never going to help you. You're never going to see a penny of it, and the only way to stop it is to vote against this fellow named Roosevelt. Does any of this sound familiar? Does this playbook sound like something you've seen recently? This is exactly what the Republicans are doing to the Affordable Care Act, to the effort by this Congress and this President to make health insurance more affordable, to make the policies more valuable, to help working families, and to try to make sure that those who are uninsured have a chance to buy insurance. Because you see, uninsured people get sick too, and they go to the hospital, and they get treated, and when they can't pay, we pay for it. We pay for it. Everybody with a health insurance plan pays more because those people in the hospital can't afford to. If we bring more and more people into insurance coverage under Obamacare, it's going to mean they accept their personal responsibility to buy health insurance, and their bills don't become our bills. Republicans want to repeal that. They are replaying the same script and same scenario that we saw when they tried to abolish Social Security. Let's not let it happen. Let's move forward in a positive way. Health insurance is more than just some privilege. From my point of view, it's one of the most basic rights of this country. If you have ever been in a situation with a serious illness in your family, and when you have no health insurance, you'll never forget it. It happened to me and my wife. We'll never forget it as long as we live. I don't want to see another family in that situation. repealing Obamacare could create it. I hope that we have the good sense to vote down the Vitter Amendment. Stand for good, affordable health insurance for working families, whether they work in the private sector, the public sector, for Congress. Make sure that they have an employer's contribution so that health insurance is affordable. The Vitter Amendment is a step back in time. It is a step back in time that will eliminate the protection of health insurance for literally thousands, if not millions, of Americans. That is not the way to go. It may make sense to the senator from Louisiana. It makes no sense to the working families of America. I yield the floor.
The senator from Michigan.
I want to say a brief word about yesterday's tragic and senseless violence at the Washington Navy Yard. The men and women who help protect our nation, those in uniform, and the thousands of civilians who serve the Department of Defense make enormous sacrifices for us. Facing a workplace gunman should not have been one of them. Those of us who have died or been wounded and their families and loved ones are in our thoughts and in our hearts today. I come to the floor this morning to discuss another act of senseless violence and our nation's response. In the early morning hours of August 21st, the Syrian military began firing artillery rockets into the suburbs east of Damascus, hitting neighborhoods held by opposition forces that have been fighting to end the brutal dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. We know from the accounts of independent observers, such as Human Rights Watch, and the work of our intelligence services and those of our allies, that many of these rockets were armed with warheads carrying sarin, a deadly nerve gas. We know that these rockets were launched from areas under the control of Assad's regime, using munitions known to be part of Assad's arsenal, and into areas held by opposition forces. We know from the report of the UN weapons inspectors released yesterday that the weapons used, both the rockets and the chemical itself, were a professional manufacturer, including weapons known to be in Syria's government's arsenal. There is no other source of this deadly gas except the Syrian government. Nothing else makes any sense whatsoever. Now, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent at this time that the next 2.5 pages approximately of my statement be inserted in the record in this point as though read.
Without objection.
Mr. President, some have expressed doubts that Assad and Russia will follow through on the agreement which was reached in Geneva. To address these doubts, we must inspect, verify, and continue to hold open the option of a strike against Assad's chemical capability if he fails to fully abide by the Geneva Agreement. What I do not understand is why some of the same voices who called for the United States to get Russia to end its obstructionism now criticize the President for getting the Russians involved. Mr. President, I was disappointed to hear my Michigan colleague, Congressman Mike Rogers, make the irresponsible claim that this agreement amounts to, quote, being led by the nose, close quote, by Russia. That contradicts his previous statements that we need to put pressure on Russia to get involved in a solution to the Syrian threat. Chairman Rogers has also said that, quote, what keeps me up at night, we know of at least a dozen or so sites in Syria that have serious chemical weapons caches. And he stressed the urgency that, quote, all the right steps are taken so that we don't lose these weapon caches and something more horrific happens, close quote. Well, thanks to U.S. pressure and a threat to take military action in response to Assad's use of chemicals, the Russians are finally getting involved in getting Syria to respond, and we have taken a major step towards securing these chemical weapons, as Chairman Rogers himself so strongly urged. We need not rely on good intentions from those who have not shown good intentions in the past. It was the credible threat of the use of military force that brought Russia and Syria to the bargaining table. It is a continued credible threat of military force that will keep them on track to uphold the provisions of that agreement. The President has made it clear, and rightfully so, that if diplomacy fails, the United States remains prepared to act. Secretary Kerry, standing right beside his Russian counterpart in Geneva, emphasized that this agreement in no way limits President Obama's option to use force if it becomes necessary. Now, many of our colleagues have stressed repeatedly in recent weeks that the credible threat of military force is essential to reining in Assad. And I strongly agree. For the life of me, I cannot understand why those who have taken that position would now argue, as some of those same colleagues are arguing, that the Geneva Agreement is somehow of little or no use because they say it somehow removes the option to use force. The Geneva Agreement says nothing of that sort. But their argument isn't just inaccurate. It is damaging to our efforts. Why would those who believe that the threat of force is essential to keeping pressure on Syria and Russia want to argue that it is no longer available? Why would those who have accurately said that the United States does not need international approval to use its military forces now argue that the Geneva Agreement leaves us in the position of needing to get international approval to use force in this case, when the Geneva Agreement does nothing of the sort? Some have criticized the Geneva Agreement for not doing more to aid the Syrian opposition. Russia and Syria tried to get an agreement from us to not support the opposition, but they failed to get that agreement from us in the Geneva Agreement or anywhere else. And indeed, the administration is seeking ways to facilitate the additional support for the opposition that so many of us believe is essential. I believe we should facilitate the provision of additional military aid to the opposition, particularly the vetted elements of Syria's opposition forces, including anti-tank weapons. Such aid will help the Syrian people defend themselves from the brutal Assad regime, furthering our goal of bringing a negotiated end to his rule. And I find it troubling, Mr. President, that so much of the commentary on this topic has not dealt with substance and policy. Washington has been and always will be a political town. But if we now reach the point where politics seems to be the only lens through which so many people around here view the most important and serious matters of the day, including national security, speculation as to motives or about potential winners or losers or who's up or who's down miss the point. This is not an ice skating contest with points awarded for style. What is important is our national security and whether this agreement advances it. Removing weapons of mass destruction from the hands of a brutal dictator, a preliminary outcome, yes, but real and tangible, is the direct result of American leadership. A month or a year or 5 years ago, an agreement to eliminate Assad's chemical weapons would have been seen as a significant gain for our security and for the world's security, and not just for the president who achieved it, but far more importantly, again, for the safety of our people, of our troops, and the entire world. I hope, as we continue with the hard work of implementing this agreement, and as we seek an end to Bashar al-Assad's rule, that we can keep our eyes on those goals and skip the superficial political scorekeeping and the inaccurate potshots that distract us from achieving those goals. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, as we rise today, I want to talk about the economy and the need to create an economic climate that encourages job growth and strengthens the middle class. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge, as many as my colleagues have, the tragedy that occurred here at the Washington Navy Yard yesterday. We're going to debate a lot of issues. The business of the country goes on. The business of the Senate goes on. But for the families of the victims of that tragedy yesterday, things stand still. And it's important for all of us, I think, to take a moment and to mourn with them the loss that they've experienced and to extend our thoughts and prayers to their families and to their loved ones. It's a horrible, horrible tragedy. And as we continue the back and forth that we have on the issues of the day here, I hope, Mr. President, that we'll all remember and keep in our thoughts and prayers those families. Mr. President, I do want to speak today to the economy. The President is yet again this week, in fact, he gave a speech yesterday where he was pivoting back to the economy, a topic that millions of unemployed Americans haven't had the luxury of pivoting away from. For most Americans, they are living this economy every single day in their personal lives. And so when the President talks about pivoting back to the economy, this has been a repivot and a repivot many, many times. He talks about something else for a while and then talks about coming back to the economy. Well, for the American people, the economy was, and has been, and will continue to be the issue for them and their families. And so as the President steps up his rhetoric to try and convince a skeptical public that his policies have somehow helped our economy, I think it's important to point out that the President's policies, according to the facts, simply aren't working. The reality is the participation in the labor force continues to decline. The August jobs numbers report a labor participation rate of 63.2%, and that's the lowest participation rate since August of 1978, 35 years ago, when President Carter was president. What this means, Mr. President, is that thousands of Americans hadn't given up looking for work. The unemployment rate would be over 10%. We talk about the reported unemployment rate, which is 7.3, 7.4. It's hovered around that range for a long time. But the real unemployment rate should include those who have quit looking for work. And when you add that number in, the unemployment rate goes up to 10.6%. In August, the number of long-term unemployed, and those are those people who have been jobless for 27 weeks or more, remained roughly at 4.3 million people. Those individuals accounted for 37.9% of the unemployed. So we're not seeing any improvement in the area of people who have been without jobs for a long period of time. Worse yet, 60% of the jobs created this year were part-time jobs. We continue to see, Mr. President, evidence that the President's policies, President Obama's policies, are leading to not the creation of full-time jobs, but the creation of part-time jobs. In other words, Americans are having to work more than one job to make ends meet, and therefore reducing the take-home pay for them and their families. And that's another thing that we have seen. Take-home pay has gone down in this President's time in office. The American people understand that the President's economic policies have fallen short, and that's why, as you look at these various polls, most Americans, a majority of Americans, disapprove of the President's handling of the economy. The reality remains that this administration's policies are hurting jobs in our economy. And, Mr. President, the President's signature health care law is probably as much to blame for that as anything else. As I talk to employers in my state of South Dakota and across the country, the recurring theme is that the mandates, the requirements, all the new red tape associated in the higher taxes with the President's health care law is meaning higher taxes and fewer hours for American workers. According to Americans for Tax Reform, there are 20 new or higher taxes in Obamacare that will hit American families and small businesses. As a result of these taxes and other policies in Obamacare, the President's signature health care law is significantly impacting what matters most to people, and that is their jobs and their ability to provide for their families. It's no secret that a good job is a critical part of the American dream. But this President's policies are putting that dream farther and farther out of reach for many Americans. In fact, in selling the law, former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi declared at the time, and I quote, "This bill is not only about the health security of America, it's about jobs. In its life, it will create 4 million jobs, 400,000 jobs almost immediately," end quote. Well, the former Speaker's claims run completely contrary and counter to what we are seeing. People are working fewer hours, and as the numbers I presented before demonstrate, fewer people are actually even participating in the labor force. Americans are discouraged by the lack of economic growth and by Obamacare's impact on employers and their ability to offer quality jobs. It's taking its toll on our economy. Just last week, Investors Business Daily reported that due to Obamacare, at least 258 employers cut work hours or jobs so far. Meanwhile, according to the United States Chamber of Commerce, 71% of small businesses say the law makes it harder to hire workers. And according to the July Fed Beige Book, the health care law has been cited as a job market concern. And they go on to quote from that report, several retailers reported that the Affordable Care Act would lead to more part-time and temporary versus full-time hiring, end quote. The President's health care law is smothering employers in bureaucratic red tape, uncertainty, and taxes. Already more than 20,000 pages of regulations have come from the 2,700-page law. The time and cost of complying with these regulations places a serious burden on the ability to spend time and energy creating new jobs. Time and money that would be spent opening a new store, increasing hours, upgrading equipment that would create more jobs is instead being spent on lawyers and consultants that have to help small businesses interpret all of the regulations, all the requirements, and all the mandates created by this administration's health care law. Poll after poll, Mr. President, has shown that Obamacare is extremely unpopular among a majority of Americans. According to a recent CNN-ORC international poll, nearly 60% of Americans said they oppose the Democrat signature law. I would hope that the President would begin to be honest with the American people about what this law truly means for jobs and for our economy. And I would hope that he would begin to listen to Americans. If he does, he'll find out what most of us have discovered a long, long time ago, and that is the American people don't want this. American employers and small businesses believe it will lead to fewer jobs and lower take-home pay for the people that they employ. So, Mr. President, I would hope that in the days ahead, as we focus on the economy and as the President is sincere about his pivot back to the economy, that he will take into consideration what really ails the economy. And that is excessive taxes, regulations, red tape, bureaucracy, mandates and requirements, many of which are associated with his signature achievement, and that is the Obamacare health care legislation. What the country does not need right now is another tax increase. What the country needs right now, Mr. President, are policies that will expand and grow the economy, that will reform our tax code in a way that lowers rates and makes us more competitive in the global marketplace, that unleashes American energy in a way that gives us a competitive advantage over our foreign competitors. And we can do that by all the President has to do is sign off, for example, on the Keystone Pipeline, which would create thousands of jobs immediately and many more once it's fully built and working. Mr. President, it would also mean that we do away with the onerous, burdensome requirements of the Obamacare legislation and replace it with policies that make sense, that actually focus on what will give Americans more access to affordable health care in this country. That we reduce spending here in Washington, D.C., and quit looking at every solution or every problem as an opportunity to raise taxes. That seems to be the Democrat solution for everything. Their budget proposed a $1 trillion tax increase. The leader of the Democrats here in the Senate has said that tax reform has to include $1 trillion in new taxes. It's not new taxes. It's not, I shouldn't say revenues, that is the problem here in Washington, Mr. President. It is spending. If you look at revenues, they're up $284 billion in the first 11 months of this year. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. We don't need another tax increase. We need policies that will lower the rates, that will get rid of the red tape and the regulations that are strangling our economy and allow our small businesses to create jobs, to make lives better for middle-class Americans and to improve the take-home pay for every family in this country. The job-killing mandates in Obamacare are harmful to our economy. They are harmful to jobs. It is time, Mr. President, that we delay or repeal it and replace it with common-sense alternatives. And we believe that discussion needs to occur, and I hope the President will allow it to occur. It's time to focus on comprehensive revenue-neutral tax reform of our broken tax system, repeal the mandates in Obamacare, and get rid of a lot of the government red tape and regulations that are making it more difficult and more expensive for employers in this country, for small businesses to create jobs. Mr. President, those are the types of things that will get the economy unleashed, that will expand and grow the economy and create more jobs for ordinary working-class Americans who are without work, and get the take-home pay for families in this country up, and allow the quality of life and the standard of living to improve for every American family. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
President.